We're so excited to have Cara Wall with us, and I'm going to introduce our staff member, Karen Schreck, who is also an author. Karen, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Courtney. I wanted to open tonight's conversation by introducing our special guest. Cara Wall is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and Stanford University. While at Iowa, Cara taught fiction writing in the undergraduate creative writing department, as well as at the Iowa Young Writers Studio in her capacity as founder and inaugural director. Inaugural. Her first novel, The Dearly Beloved, was a Read with Jenna book club selection, one of Entertainment Weekly's 10 best debut novels, and a New York Times editor's choice. For her writing about faith, marriage, and family from multiple points of view, Cara was longlisted for the Center of Fiction First Novel Prize, earned a 2021 Wilbur Award, and is the 2021 Ragdale Foundation Hannah Judy Gretz Fellow. She lives in New York City with her family. Welcome, Cara.
Thank you.
So looking forward to talking with you.
Me too.
Great. And welcome to all who are with us tonight. Please do share your questions for Cara in the chat, and we will allow time for those at the end of toward the end of our time together. So I wanted to start with this really simple question. I hope it seems good to you. When someone who hasn't read your novel asks what it's about in terms of plot, what do you say?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question because before I sold it and it was coming out, the easiest way I think to describe the novel is to say it's about a minister who is told his son will never understand the concept of God. I haven't been able to say that for a long time because that was sort of a spoiler alert. I don't think it's necessarily a spoiler for the book, but it's a relief to just get to say that now that the book has been out for so long. That was really the germ of the idea. Yeah, but I mean, before that, I would often just say it's about two couples who we follow from their first meetings and all the way through their first big life crises, and that's the arc that I was really interested in following, sort of how we become connected to one another.
It's so interesting because I hadn't realized that was the seed of the novel, that dynamic between the minister and his son.
Yeah.
Could I ask what brought that to you? The dynamic, the relationship?
Well, no, I mean, so I grew up with two ministers in my church, and one of them did have a son who he was told would never understand the concept of God. So it's, this is not in any way historically accurate or about any actual people, but that was just something that I knew had happened to the minister in my church. So it was just always an interesting concept to me. I actually think I learned that when I was like 12, and it's always sort of been I was just always like, that's so weird and interesting. Like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah.
It's like if I had a daughter who couldn't read,
right?
You'd be like, what are you going to do with your time? But anyway,
right.
Yeah,
right. What would you say The Dearly Beloved is really about at its core in terms of your vision as a novelist, not related to plot, but more about the meaning?
Yeah. I think that my idea of that has changed, but the one that since it's been out and since I sort of did the last revision, the one that I think is really true and actually really relevant these days is that it's actually really about empathy. It's about, so I set out to explore for myself in this book this idea of commitment and how we commit to each other. It was in earlier versions, it was really more like, how do we make friends? Like, how do we end up friends? How do friendships that might just start with a coffee and then a dinner and then a party at someone's house, how does that become a 25-year friendship? and I just wanted to sit and examine that really closely. And it was also about how do you maintain long-term community relationships, long-term partner relationships. And I think the answer that came to me in writing this book was that this was really an exploration of how you become radically empathetic. And that was something I learned a lot about while I was writing this book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I think about the community relationship part, I realize, I love the way it kind of opened as you moved toward the end. It begins with the four individual characters who are central to the book on their own, and then the kind of dyads that they form in their partnerships and then coming together. But then one of the most fascinating things are the characters who are who have less presence in the book in terms of taking up pages, but who are so significant to those key characters that we know probably a bit better.
Yeah.
In terms of shaping their lives and moving them through conflicts and challenges.
Yeah.
And it's like, that expansion.
I get goosebumps when people ask me about this sort of ancillary characters or like helping characters, because I think we all have those people in our life. Like either we have a fantastic teacher who you will never forget, or a great friend that you had in graduate school that maybe you're not in touch with anymore. Just these people come into your life and give you something really special that propels you either along the path that you were going on or a totally different path.
Yeah.
And the characters that come in the end, Annalise and Marcus, they're there. I really, really wanted the book to be one cycle, and then these four characters sort of waving the next generation off on their first cycle. So that was really important to me. I talked about that with actually my editor at Simon Schuster quite a bit, because she didn't really love the Marcus and Annalise stories. So we cut it down, but I said this is always where I wanted the book to end. I always wanted it to be like we've lived through this big life crisis, and now we've found a way to be hopeful for this new generation as we send them off into the world.
Right. And also the reciprocity of that. They've given to us, and we can give back to them.
Yeah.
I'm curious. I just want to ask. This just popped in my head. But what was the reservation about that kind of the characters that came on board later in the book?
She was right, as she always is. My editor, Mary Segucci, Simon Schuster. From the very moment I talked to her, she talked about how this book was sort of like a locked box mystery, and that you have this very enclosed community. I mean, most of the book takes place among these four characters in this church, and she just wanted that to stay that compact and not sort of open up and unravel so much at the end.
Yeah.
So that's, it originally ended with Marcus and Annalise's wedding, and she said that she didn't, she suggested that maybe I change that, and that was going to be really hard for me. And then one day I woke up and I said, oh, it can just be Lola's christening, and I really won't have to change anything. I'll still be in the church, and Charles will still say the same things, and everybody will still be there. It just won't be a wedding.
Right.
And then it took me like 15 minutes to change
it. But it'll still have it feeling of ceremony. Yeah.
That was a great lesson for me as an author, because somebody might suggest something to you that you feel like is a humongous change, but it might not be. It might just be a quick focusing or quick change the channel or something. So
right.
That was a big a big authorial lesson for me, which I'm
Yeah,
glad I got.
it's a big life lesson for me, actually. That's just great. So as I was preparing for our conversation and also for the library's October book group, where we'll be discussing the Dearly Beloved, and I encourage any of you who aren't part of the book group but would love to talk about Cara's book to join us. You can ask us at the end how to do that, and we'll be glad to tell you. But in my preparations, I had the opportunity to read your book for a third time. And I love doing that as a practice, especially I love reading a book and then listening to a book. But this time with your book, I read it, listened to it, and the reader was fantastic, and then read it again. So this time around, I was just really struck by different aspects of the book and details that I hadn't noticed, nuances about character and setting, that I hadn't picked up, and the connections across the patterns kind of you were building, those connections across the pages. But I was particularly struck by the way you use point of view in the book, narrative perspective. I don't know how it was that it had passed over me before, and it's maybe because it's done so seamlessly. So the way that you move back and forth between the characters, it was the thing I focused on most in terms of this reading. Okay. So I don't know, it's kind of hard to talk about something like the way you use point of view or multiple perspectives, or shifting narrators without reading a little bit from the book to kind of amplify what we're kind of discussing. Yeah. So I'm just wondering if you would mind doing that, and also then we get to hear your voice.
Sure. I came prepared. So Karen and I talked about this a little bit before, and so this is a section that happens on page 145. So it's sort of right in the middle of the book, and it's when the book is really set in 3 sections. One is about the couples meeting each other, so husbands and wives meeting each other, and then those 2 couples come together when the men are both hired to be co-ministers at a church in Greenwich Village. So this scene is, I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs, but this is when the 2 men meet each other for the first time. And so they are I'll just start reading. Okay, so it says, scheduled for their 3rd Presbyterian interviews on the same day, Charles and James sat in a wide 2nd-floor hallway outside a heavy wooden door, waiting to be invited in. They had not been introduced and took that to mean they should not speak, but they saw each other. Charles saw a wiry man, a wound-up clock ticking with purpose. He could see it was an effort for James not to pace, though he could hear him humming with energy like a light bulb. He saw the kind of man who made him most nervous, who formulated his thoughts quickly and voiced them with force. If this was the kind of man the church wanted, then he, Charles, with his love of obscure texts and academic analysis, did not stand a chance. James saw a tall, hale man whose good navy blazer, monogrammed shirt, and khaki pants evoked a wealthy literary upbringing. Charles's slight stoop and the glasses in his breast pocket spoke of intellectual ability. His steady gaze suggested a deep respect for the thread of history. If 3rd Presbyterian wanted an academic, James thought, then why was he here?
Yeah. Great, thank you. And then right after that, you move into this section where it's something they both could be experiencing. It talks about the they.
Right.
It moves from these 2 individuals to the they, I think, really for the first time in terms of their friendship that will develop and working relationship. And then it shifts out again into Charles' thoughts. And I was just so struck by that, because that kind of writing doesn't at least in my experience, I don't see that as often in contemporary literature. It seems like you stick with a point of view in a certain section and then make a very conscious shift if you're going to even do that in another very separate section, not in the same.
Yeah, I think that's probably the cleaner way to do it as an author. But I am just so constantly. So, one of the things that I'm super interested in life all the time is I just want to know everything about everybody. And not, I just want to know what you're thinking and what your deepest thoughts are and what your feelings are. I was an only child, so maybe I just need to know everybody. And so when I write that, I just think, what's this character thinking right now? What's this character thinking right now? And I just think it's a very satisfying experience to see what different people think about the same thing going on, being in the same room and being able to see everybody's point of view at once instead of having to wait. And it was something that I really thought about, using how to use the first person point of view, a close third person with everybody. But that's just natural for me. It's just my point of view. It's just what I want to know about all these characters. And then the question was for me, when is it feeling natural and when is it feeling clunky? It was really important to me to be able to do that, especially when the married couples were talking to each other in relationship, because you could split it up into two, like Charles's point of view and his wife Lily's point of view, but then you miss that that just the relationship of the conversation, the way the relationship is, like you're saying one thing and maybe you're thinking something different, or maybe you're trying to figure out how to say it in a way they'll take it. So that it was a little bit tricky, but that it wasn't hard tricky for me, because that's just what I want to learn. Like that's what I want to learn about people by writing books.
Yeah. Was it difficult like to shape them so they balanced and one didn't dominate the other, or it suddenly tipped into, oh, it's really, Charles who's the central protagonist, and then you have these other roles who are more minor?
But I realized sort of, I don't know how many drafts in, but later in the process, that Nan was getting sort of short shrift, because she's the people pleaser and she's the one who's trying to keep all these people together, not very successfully, but so when I really felt like the book was gelling and finished, I was like, oh, but Nan, I don't really know as much about Nan as I know about the other people. Mm-hmm. And so I really just split it. I counted pages, and I was like, okay, well, how many pages it really focused on Charles, and how many on Lily, and how many on James, and how many on Nan? And then I just sat and wrote Nan 5 more pages. And it was so interesting, because I think she was a little bit boring at one point. And when I really sat down with her, and took time to really explore the parts I hadn't explored of her life, they came out really beautifully. I mean, they added so much to everybody else's story. As if you think of it, because I grew up in church and singing in choir, so if you think of it as a 4-part harmony, that everything that I added with her life in London, that part where she goes to church but on her own, and for once she can just do her faith the way she wants to, without worrying about what James thinks about her faith. And that was all just really moving for me, and I thought added a lot to the book. So I would say that was the biggest one. I mean, I would never have let any of them be. They really all needed to be equal. I just think that the other 3 characters were a little more dynamic, so they came to me first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know what it exactly means, but I'm thinking it's so interesting that Nan, the character you just described, is trying to keep everybody together.
Yeah.
is the one who's in fact was initially kind of in the background
Yeah.
and not, I mean, she's definitely not in the new version of the book. I find her just a really fully developed
Yes.
character and very moving to me. One of the more moving, well, of all of them are moving, but moving in her own unique way, as almost kind of being, there's the scene where she says she's in this knitting group and
Yep.
she realizes that most of the women are older and soon she might be the only one who's there who's like them, almost as if she represents is kind of inhabiting a past that is slowly
Yeah.
fading away.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I just saw a quick comment down there that she's like, I like Nan, but she irritated me so much.
Yeah.
And I will say, literally, anytime I talk about this book, or when I first went out into the world with this book and did author talks, and people would be like, oh, I really hated Lily. And I'd be like, really? And then someone would be like, oh, I can't stand Nan. And they sort of split into Team Nan and Team Lily.
Yes.
And it was super interesting to me because I was like, where is this coming from? Are they both awesome? I was like, yeah. But one of my best friend's husbands took me out to dinner to talk about the book because he loved it so much. And he was like, but that Lily, I just did not like her. And I was like, really? Because you're kind of married to her. Like,
whoops.
Not really, but just sort of like, you know.
That's really interesting. Well, I love hearing that. I mean, and I think this is very unique about this book. Men respond well, it seems I think what you're saying, to this novel. I mean, have you gotten that sense that it has appeal for both
I
men and women?
I do. I think you know, I've definitely on Instagram and other times when I interact with readers, they'll definitely say, I made my husband read this because I loved it so much and he loved it too. You know, I don't think it's I don't know. I don't know who's picking up the book and buying it. It could be lots of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I definitely get that a lot.
Right.
And I did have another friend of mine, I saw her husband at a cocktail party and he was like, I just got back from China and I read your book all the way here and I sobbed. And I was like, okay. I didn't know him well enough to know if he's a crier. But I was like, okay, good. Well, thank you.
Wow.
I like that.
So yeah, was moving to him about that.
Yeah.
I just saw someone say I loved and hated Lily. So I think that maybe there are very strong reactions.
Very strong reactions.
Yeah. So there's the Vanity Fair review of The Dearly Beloved, and the reviewer points out, because then I started looking for reviews and interviews where you talked about point of view. And the reviewer pointed out that, quote, the way you, Cara, move between the thoughts of your protagonist turns what could seem an inquiry into the nature of religion into a visceral look at how religion binds people together.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting. I also thought it also emphasized the way they're bonded together in all kinds of ways over time because of the nature of the novel and so much time passing in this novel.
Right.
That kind of back and forth movement, like weaving them.
Yeah. It's funny because I don't think of this as a book about religion. I really think of it as a book about faith in all its iterations, faith in each other, faith in yourself, faith in your community. And it's for some reason that distinction between those words is really clear to me, and I think maybe it's in the wider world they seem interchangeable.
The distinction between religion and faith.
Yeah.
What do you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in certain conversations and everything, I think they can be used interchangeably, but I set this book in a Christian church. That's where I grew up. And it was beloved to me, and my parents are still there. They've been members more than 50 years, and it was really the heart of my community growing up. So it started out as just a setting. I mean, it was sort of like, and it worked because I could get all four characters in these walls and they would have to stay together. So
Yeah.
I could explore that. Yeah, so it's interesting because
Yeah.
I don't really think of it as a religious book.
Yeah.
I think of it as all sorts of concepts of different faiths, some of which are religious.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that's you. In one interview, you said you talked about how the language of talking about faith is limited. I think that's what you said. And I just have to say, this is my can be my connotation that,
Yeah.
you know, when you talk about it being a religious book, maybe the implication would be that there's something preachy or didactic about it,
Right.
and there's nothing.
No.
And it is so much more a part about the whole of a life and how spirituality, faith is perhaps to a lesser or greater degree
Yeah.
part of what shapes us, whether we reject it or embrace it, and
Yeah.
however we embrace it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you have said that writing The Dearly Beloved was, and this is another quote, this is a perfect time to ask this question, a radical stretching into each character's belief system.
Yeah.
A huge expansion into their hearts and minds. I think that's such a beautiful way of writing about characterization, about imagining characterization. And then in another interview, you wrote, I didn't come out of the experience with any clear answers, but I did finish the book with a deep feeling of acceptance that I found very comforting. And you've described sitting inside the faiths of the characters, caring about every nuance of them, even the parts in which you did not believe and you describe that experience as heart opening. And I have lots of questions about all things.
Okay.
So one of them, I just want to, now I'm thinking about the word acceptance. I find that fascinating, but go ahead.
So I think my biggest, if you want to call it a spiritual journey, I've definitely thought of my spirituality as yoga, as Buddhism, as all sorts of different things on my life journey. But I think what I got from this book was, and I talked about a little bit before, was just this empathy, but how hard empathy is. I think it's a buzzword, and we all are supposed to be empathetic, and that's going to solve the world. But you're just like, if you really sit with a view that you find either difficult to understand or totally antithetical to your own belief system, and you can somehow quiet all the parts in you that think, this is going to be too hard, I'm too uncomfortable, I can't do, like, at some point you just, or I did when I was sitting in these characters, I don't mean to say you, but when I was sitting in these characters and trying to just truly just feel how they felt about whatever part of the book I was writing, I would just get to a point where something in me would relax and I would completely stop judging that character. So, and I knew that was my job, and I think that's why I really worked at it so hard. It was my job to portray or tell the stories of these characters who are real people to me in a way that is incredibly connected to them and has very little to do with me. So and it got easier and easier as I wrote the book, but I would literally feel like a resistance break in me, and I'd be like, oh, now I feel so sad for Nan. Like, I just feel sad for her now. Like, she's being so annoying, but now I really get the way that she can't help it. Not help it, but like why that's coming out and why that's her natural response. because I think all these characters were very authentic. You don't want to spend a lot of time in a book, or I didn't, with people saying things they don't mean. And, I tried to create the most authentic parts of them, or always having them in scenes where they were being really authentic. And so I guess that's the best way I can say it. And then coming out of that book, I would try to have that relationship with people, where I would just be like, you're super annoying me right now. And then I'd be like, okay, so just let all your judgment go. You don't actually have to react to this. You can just take it in and see what happens. Yeah. So I don't know. It was probably hard opening at some point, but I will say that I think, my heart got a little more armored during COVID. So that language doesn't particularly respond to me, but really something in my, like my rib cage and diaphragm is responding. So it's definitely a visceral experience for me, this experience of the moment of empathy.
I know you're hard at work writing.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how that was for you during COVID, and if part of it was that word of empathy. Was it a harder struggle to?
Well, I'm definitely behind. I'm definitely behind from where I would want to be. But really, what I did in COVID was research. So I had a lot of research to do, and I found that a really good time to do that. Both of my kids were home from boarding school, and so they were taking Zoom class from like 9 to 1, and I would just research from 9 to 1.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It was hard to write. It's hard to write when you're anxious.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I'm wondering I'm read that you discovered Writing Down the Bones, Freeing the Writer Within by Natalie Goldberg. And I wanted to ask about that. You discovered it in high school, and that book encouraged you to pursue writing. And I also wondered if even then, if there was, when did the impulse we can get back to Goldberg in a minute, but when did the impulse toward empathy in the book, in writing, start to come to you? Thinking about conceiving of creativity that way.
Question. I think always, to some extent, I have always written because I want to, not because I want to live someone else's life, but because I want to witness all of the moments of somebody's life. I don't know, I wouldn't have called that empathy. I think that I just kind of discovered that's what it was as I was writing this book. But it's interesting because I think it does, it's interesting to me that it does relate to Natalie Goldberg and the Writing Down the Bones. Actually, I think I tried to have it out here to show people the cover. But anyway, so Natalie Goldberg I took my first creative writing class as a sophomore in high school. And I'd always wanted, all I did was read as a child. I took no sports. I did no dance. I literally, every Friday night, my parents and I would go to Brentano's on 8th Street and 5th Avenue, and we would buy all our books for the weekend, and we would go home and read all weekend. That's what we did. Then we went to church on Sunday. And that is what we did every Friday night. So I was very excited to write, and I got this book, Writing Down the Bones, and I was sitting in my white pleather beanbag chair, and I read it all in like 2 or 3 hours. And it seemed like the most meaningful title of anything. Like, it was just like, of course you write down the bones. That's what you do. You go down into the bones, and that's what you write, and they're hidden, but you're bringing them out to people. And I was just, my mind was being blown. And then so I was at boarding school at this point, sorry. And another girl walked by my room, and I had the door open, and she was like, "That is the weirdest title of a book." And I was like, oh my God, I think I might be a writer. It was the first moment that I realized that not everybody wanted to do what I wanted to do. She's a great doctor now. You know, I was like, oh, okay, there's some sort of immediacy here. She's a great writer. If there are other writers out here, it's a book that where really the biggest practice is that you sit every day for 15, 30, however many minutes you want. And one of the ways you can get into it is to just start with I remember, and you just free write. And you can come back to I remember. I'm actually helping one of my friend's daughters with her college essay right now. And she's like, I just don't know where to start. And I was like, well, just take out a piece of paper and write I remember, and write for half an hour. And whenever you get stuck, you write I remember. She wrote the most beautiful essay about growing up in Zambia. And I was like, see, it's magic. It works. Yeah. So I still use it. It's a lot, but it's not about writing a book. It's really just about how to write authentically.
Right.
From your own.
And I mean, what you're talking about, kind of hunkering down inside these characters, getting in there and sitting with them. That's a very writing down the bones kind of looking.
And that's my favorite work of writing to do, is to that's really hard for me. It's like, if you saw me writing at that point, it would just look like I was staring at a wall. You know, it's just, and sometimes my family will come in, they'll be like, what are you doing? I'm like, go away, I'm thinking. And that's just a sense of, so like Lily took a long time to open up to me, like years. Like I could follow her around and I sort of knew what happened to her and whatever, but she was it took her a long time to trust me. So finally we got somewhere with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I remember, leads me to this question about the fact that you were a medieval history major in college.
Yeah.
And it seems like you have a big, interest in history and remembering. And I'm wondering if it has any way influenced your writing, that study, that fascination with history, either in the way that you studied it, the methods you used, or kind of the form of the texts you studied, particularly because it was, I don't know.
No, so I did when I was at Stanford, and I thought I would do an honors thesis, which I ended up not doing. The class you have to take to do an honors thesis at that point was the Universal Chronicler. And can there be a Universal Chronicler? So this is way before any sort of social media or Facebook or anything. So
did you say Universal
Chronicler?
Chronicler.
So can there be an unbiased recording of history?
Mm-hmm.
And that was fascinating to me. It kind of blew my mind. And I'd love to go back and see if they still even give that course, because now we sort of have this universal chronicling of the world, and that we couldn't have even imagined at that point. And maybe, I mean, and I'm just putting this together now, but maybe that's why I do these close thirds and the omniscient narrator, and try to give everybody the same balance and that kind of stuff. I mean, I've always loved historical fiction. I loved studying history. In high school, I was a curator of our high school's antique clothing collection. Like, I just feel really connected to history, and especially like physical parts of history. So I'm not sure that it would interest me to write a book that just took place in right now.
Yeah.
Well, right now I'm not interested in that. We'll see. but really, I guess I want that. I feel a little more, I I don't know, not qualified, but I just feel like, oh, well, it's in the past, so I can just tell that story like it's not happening right now.
Yeah.
I think. But it was interesting because the other way I think of the Universal Chronicler, I thought of him as a him. I thought of him as a him, which I just did. So, but I was like, well, who's that character? Like, who is the Universal Chronicler? Like, nobody in my history class really wanted to discuss that. They just wanted to discuss if we could have an unbiased history. I was like, but who would write it? Like, who's that unbiased? And so when I was writing this book, and at some point I was like, who is the narrator here? Like, what am I doing? Is it me? And it just blew my mind. And but then the narrator kind of came out from behind the curtain. It was like, it's me. And it's actually, I think of him as an avuncular, it was like the uncle of all of these characters who knows everything about them. And I'm getting to tell the story, but he's setting the mood.
Yeah, yeah.
It's his feeling so I just literally had like an artist, like my brain was blown because I was like, okay, so I have these characters, but also am I inhabiting the narrator? Is the narrator inhabiting me? And all this stuff. So I kind of wanted to be back at Iowa so I could go and like walk into the bar and be like, oh my God, what do you guys think of this? I need you all to talk to me about it. But yeah.
And then if there is someone bigger, like an authorial voice or a universal chronicler, however you want to, which I've never said before until right now. Then the four disparate characters kind of challenge that. I mean, of course, they're formed by you, but as the writer, but there's a reminder that there's also these specific, unique stories and the possibility to individuate and that kind of thing too.
I don't form my characters. I'm sorry. So I just want to.
You don't form them?
No, the characters are real people, and in fact, they don't do the things that I want them to do. So I will form the story in the way you kind of prune a tree or something. But really, my job as a writer is to let every character that's in my head is a real person to me,
and let them lead you.
Yep. I just kind of follow them around and watch what they're doing. Yeah. And then
it's so interesting. I know there are two camps. I've heard people say that characters do that. They come to them and they lead them.
Yeah.
And then there are other people who say, I make an amalgamation of different people I know and, plot it out and have a sense of figure out their conflict, their challenge, and where they're going to go. But that's not what you experience.
No. Well, I don't write linearly, and I'm not very good at plot. So I don't know if I'm not very good at plot because I'm just letting the characters take me around their world. But I don't. So when I'm writing now, it's not in any sort of order. It's just, this day I'm going to learn this about this character, and then tomorrow I'm going to learn something about another character, and at some point I'm going to have to put it together so other people can understand it.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And so you kind of figure out what happens.
I mean, I have a concept. I knew in the Dearly Beloved that that the bulk of it would take place in the church, and that the characters were very different, but and I think I had like 3 plot points that really came out of real life, so I knew what I was writing toward. But in terms of how they got there, I just would start, I'd sit down and it would just come out of me like, okay, well, Nan's real name was Mary and she was from Mississippi and it was this and that, and I was like, oh, all right, I guess, let's go. Ready.
Very wonderful.
Yeah. And then so sometimes I will orchestrate, it will become clear to me that this character, so let's say when James goes to ask Nan's father if he can marry her, I know that he has to have that conversation because that's the way Nan's family is structured and works, right? They're old fashioned, and he's like screwing up his courage to do that. And so I will say, I will think, structurally, like this should probably be in his office, and where would they both sit? And in that way, I'll move them around and sort of say, okay, this is the chair that's going to make James most uncomfortable. So let's put him in that. But he's going to do all the speaking, and it's the situation is organic, but in order to like make it a little more tense, I'll definitely do things like that. Yeah.
I'm looking at the clock.
Yes. Okay. I am not. So thank you.
And I want to make sure there's time for questions. Please again, ask them.
Yeah.
Cara, I did want to ask 2 final questions of my own, and I'll just ask them very succinctly.
Yeah.
I know writers who are struggling to generate manuscripts in it because of different challenges, because of just how dang hard writing is. And I know that you intermittently worked on this novel for 15 years. And I'm wondering what kept you coming back to it over those years, and if you have any tips for those of us who are struggling to keep the writing faith.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote the whole first draft of the book in like 2 weeks. It was 100 pages long. And I had just come out of Iowa, and I knew I wanted to write a book. And, but I was pretty self-conscious at Iowa. The way they taught writing there was not the way I wrote. So it was incredible learning experience for me. But I just kind of came out of there not incredibly self-confident about my writing. So then, but I also had to get a job, and I moved to San Francisco with my then boyfriend, and there was a lot of upheaval. And so I just never felt like I had the time to do it. And really it was just that it was a terribly anxious part of my life. So it never went away. Like, I knew those characters, and I knew the book was there, and I felt really drawn to it all the time. But then I would write it and be like, that's no good. And then I put it away for a while. I was a little derailed because I had an agent earlier who really wanted me to make it a book about autism. And I tried to do it that way. And that was kind of like a 1.5-year detour. And I was like, this is not what this book is about. I mean, it's something that happens, but there's nothing in the book. So I think at some point I was just like, I have kids now, and I am going to do this freaking thing. Like, if I don't do it, I will regret it. And so at some point it just got to like, I just want to run that marathon, whether I win it or whatever. I just want to finish it. So at some point I went draft by draft then. And at some point like over 4 or 5 years, I just said, okay, I have to work on this 2 hours every day. And that was really, I don't have to write that long now when I'm writing, because I'm writing something new. I don't have to write that long. But to edit, I think that's the time it took me to get through anything. I was like, I had to allot 3 hours for procrastination, and then I had to work for 2 hours. And the way I do it, and I talk about this a lot, is I bribe myself with cookies, because they calm my anxiety. So not anxiety like but like I'll sit down and be like, is this going to be any good? It's going to be terrible. Oh, what's going to happen? So I just
like a little reward.
I just give myself cookies.
Yeah.
I just eat cookies while I'm seriously. But it's very comforting. It makes it fun,
Yeah, that's great. Maybe a little. Does it kind of get Pavlovian after a while, like cookies?
Yes. No, because I'll be like, okay, I'm making the tea, I'm choosing the cookies, I'm putting them on the plate, and now we're sitting down, and now it's work time.
I love that idea of ritual. And maybe that's a tip, like just set up rituals for yourself as a writer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool. So I really want to ask about your second novel. I know you're working at it, and how, just tell us about it, where you're at.
Okay, so it's well, the working title is Provenance, and it's about a painting that is left on the steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I actually, in the 90s, that was one of my first jobs. I worked at the Met. But it it follows, so it's just found by a curator, and they set out, he and this woman set out to find the provenance of it. For many reasons, everybody has their own desire to know what this painting is, but they're going to have the provenance. But we have the story of the people who are looking for the provenance, and then the actual story of the painting, and we go back and forth. There's 6 main characters at this point. It's pretty sweeping. It's much bigger than The Dearly Beloved, but it's really about memory and the way that we think about the past, and it's kind of a book about imagery and loss, and I'm hoping to do something really cool structurally with it, but I don't know if I can pull that off, but we'll see. So it's all about art, and it's all about finding people. Yeah,
It's great. Sounds like a wonderful read, and I'm curious if you can share where the portions in the past, where they're set,
so it's
when.
it's set. A girl is saved from some attacks in World War II, in the Exodus, which is when everybody left France, when the Germans took over France, and he saves her. Her family is obviously not going to make it, but he saves her, and he teaches her how to paint, to forge, actually. And so it takes place a little bit in World War II, and then really right after World War II. So in Italy, so in Rome and Capri, and then in England.
Great, thank you.
So that's all, yeah. And then the other part, the present part, is in New York.
Yeah.
I can never not write about New York.
Yeah. It's important. Well, thank you. And now it is late. And Courtney, can you help us with questions?
Absolutely. So we do have some questions. I did not want to interrupt your
Thank
flow. But they did come in throughout your chat. There was a comment about the smoothness of Will's transformation and that it did not seem typical of an autistic child. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that, and like maybe any research that you did on autism?
Yeah, so actually the Will character was the son of one of the ministers at my church, and his mother did actually fight for schools. His mother was a public school teacher, and at that point in time there was absolutely no education for kids with autism. They barely had a name for it that everyone was using, and she fought to have a public school for kids, for autistic kids. So it's still there. It's still in my church. It's a public school, but the church houses it. I totally understand what the question asker is saying, in that it seems very seamless. I think there weren't that many options, so it wasn't. You just kind of had to make these decisions, and you made the best ones you can. It also only goes until, at the end of the book, Will is 3, so 3 or 4. So there's a long, trajectory of his life in which would have been much more of a struggle, I think. I think that whole storyline was one of the things I was most nervous about, because I really wanted to be telling it in a way that was not patronizing, was not too slick or anything. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. I just sort of took it as a small slice of that period, that time, and it's not really historically accurate, because he wouldn't have been diagnosed that early. but he had a twin. So, and his mother was a teacher, so you could kind of tell that something was happening. And in real life, he was the youngest of four boys, the third of four boys. So he was diagnosed pretty early, I think. Yeah.
So next question, and I don't believe this was brought up unless I missed it. I was curious about choosing Wheaton as one of the schools. How did you choose Wheaton College?
I wish I had a better answer for this, but you know, I knew James came from Chicago. I knew that Nan was going to her dad was going to send her off to become a more worldly person. And I was like, well, James is going to be in Chicago and they're going to date in college. And then I was just researching. I'd heard of Wheaton, obviously, but I was researching and I was like, oh, look, he could drive there to date her. That would work really well. So that's how it came up. I mean, I knew it had a good music program, and it, you know, so she could sing and play and all that kind of stuff. So I think it was just sort of a happy accident. If Wheaton hadn't been there, I would have had to make up a school. I was just really glad I didn't have to make up a school. Yeah.
Have you ever been to Wheaton?
No.
Okay, well,
Come on over.
Someday. I looked at pictures. I did research. Yeah.
Come visit us next time
Okay.
you're in Chicagoland.
Great.
So the next question, you did touch on this a little bit, but if you could elaborate a little bit more. So this person asks, as a person raised in the church and now outside of the church, your book was a balm. It reminded me of the story about Thomas Hardy, no longer able to believe doctrine, but would lean against the outside wall of the church during a service, unable to go anymore and listen to the music. That was church that he could still do. I wondered about your relationship to church while I was reading the book. Could you comment on this?
I did not know that story, and it's giving me goosebumps. So I went to church throughout my childhood. I sang in the junior choir, and I did not really go to church in college or past that. I just kind of explored my spirituality in different ways, even though in college a lot of my friends were still very devout Christians. And in fact, the sophomores on the football team all got converted to Christianity in college, so it was like a nice, interesting situation. But I started going to church again when my daughter was a professional chorister at Grace Church here in New York City, and they have the Episcopal British children's choir. Like the kids are the choir, and I started going, and it was just an interesting situation to be going to a church that I didn't grow up in. But it did bring me back to the idea of church as a community. I think when I was moving around a lot, I just was like, well, I'd have to go find a church. I'd have to go audition churches, and I don't want to do that. And that seemed weird to me. So when I found this new church as a community, that was pretty cool. So it really made me feel like an adult. Like I was like, I go to church every Sunday now. I guess I'm a grown-up. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I do, I never lost the sense of church as a way to worship. So I didn't really ever leave the idea of church. I just was church-less for a little while. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. If anyone else has any more questions for Cara, you can put them in the Q&A or the chat. I don't see any more questions. There were some comments that I can share. That person agreed that the book was about so many aspects of faith. And then they said they definitely felt this weird shift between judgment and empathy while reading the book. So seems like a big theme there. And that they appreciated the baby shower in the story and that it was a great explosive device.
Yeah, you know what? That one I actually made up. That one I actually engineered because I knew they had to have some sort of conflict. Like Lily had to really hurt Nan in some way, and so I sort of did it. That was authorial, but I liked that too. It just seemed like the biggest insult anyone could do to Nan, could give Nan is just to like thumb their nose at that entire thing. And then I also really liked it because Charles had to clean up after it. And that was totally organic. I was like, oh no, I did this thing and now Charles has to go take care of it. I feel so bad for him. Yeah.
And the same person said thanks, that answers the question, and also that baby showers are still explosive events today. So much baggage.
Well, it's a multi-generational situation, right? So it can be really, and then you got in-laws, it can be very bad. Yeah.
And that also cookies are underrated. It's very interesting to know that's what motivates you to get your words in.
Yesterday, I went out about like 6 different packs of cookies.
Wow.
Because I kind of just finished part 2 of the book-ish. So I got to start a new part. And so I was like, oh, this is going to be a 10 cookie day. I got to get myself down there.
Sounds like a deadline might be pressing.
Yes, indeed.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And huge thanks to Karen for bringing Cara to us. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight and sharing your book, The Dearly Beloved, which we have in our library collection, or you can purchase from any bookstore or Amazon. And we will send you all an email once the recording is available, and we'll send some links. And I put the book in the chat that Cara recommended, Writing Down the Bones, for any aspiring writers out there. So thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me. That was a great set of questions. So I really appreciate it.
So good to talk with you.
Everyone have a wonderful night.
You too. Bye.